Hello, and welcome to this short video on Lesson 4. Lesson 4 covers two chapters in our textbook, Chapter 20 and Chapter 21. Chapter 20 is a real mix of different kinds of themes, generally covering the 1920s, the period of time after World War I, but up to the start of the Great Depression at the end of the 1920s. Overall, there were a couple of things, big things going on in that decade. One was a rise of the intensity of racism and intolerance on one hand, and on the other hand, there was a push for greater civil rights and freedoms and liberties by certain groups of Americans that were not able to enjoy all the rights that other Americans had. For example, women. Women did achieve the right to vote in 1920, which is a great big gain for them. However, there were also the remaining many limitations for women in the workplace, society, politics, and culturally. At the beginning of the decade, or near the beginning of the decade, a group of activist women attempted to introduce an equal rights amendment to the Constitution. That effort failed. It failed in large part because other women activists were against it. For example, one of the arguments by women, and these are progressive women, by the way, against an ERA, was that during the progressive era, women had made many gains, especially in labor legislation, limiting work hours, improving working conditions, minimum wage laws, and so forth, all across the country at state and local levels. The argument that they made is that an equal rights amendment would wipe out all of those gains. On the other hand, women that were in favor of the amendment, like Alice Paul, for example, argued that those legislations, they're called protective labor legislations for women, were actually discriminatory against women, made them reinforce the idea that women were vulnerable, women were weak, and that they needed those kinds of protections. She said, or made the case, that an ERA would wipe them out, but in the long run, women would be better off with an amendment, such an amendment to the Constitution. Now, at the end of the decade of the 1920s and late 1929, the big important development that happened was the beginning of the Great Depression, which then leads us into the 1930s, which is the topic of Chapter 21, and the New Deal, which was Franklin Roosevelt's and his administration's attempt to deal with that Great Depression. Many things were tried during the 1930s. Roosevelt had pretty much everyone at that time. Almost everyone were what they called fiscal conservatives. Roosevelt himself believed in a balanced budget and limited government spending and so forth. But at the same time, due to the extreme crisis as a result of the Depression, Roosevelt was willing to set aside those beliefs in the interest of pragmatism in trying to deal with this terrible crisis. And so one thing to pay attention to overall is that the New Deal does introduce many new elements, but the one thing it doesn't do is it doesn't try to overthrow the system. It's an attempt to work within the capitalist system. Like, for example, the Wagner Act of 1935, which is part of that second New Deal, along with Social Security. The Wagner Act gave federal protection and recognition to the right of workers to form and join labor unions, and the right of those unions to expect to be able to negotiate contracts with employers. that was Roosevelt's attempt to redistribute wealth rather than trying to take it directly from corporations of people who had it and have it redistributed uh, down the economic ladder. He reasoned that giving unions more power would in fact do that in the long run, right? They would wind up um, asking for and bargaining for higher wages for workers and better working conditions, which is actually exactly what happened during the 1930s and 40s and even into the 1950s. Another thing about the New Deal to remember is that it was very forward-looking in a lot of ways, but it never really was able to end the Depression. It did make some dents in it. There was improvement in some people's lives, but overall, the Depression would continue despite those efforts to do something about it until the end of the decade. And really, the end of the New Deal really I mean, the end of the Great Depression really comes about as a result of World War II, which is part of a story of the next chapter in Lesson 5. So I'm going to end this and make this not too long of a video for Lesson 4, and I encourage you to keep up with the work, and again, I hope you're enjoying the learning experience, and I'm available anytime, remember that. Contact me with any questions or concerns through Blackboard, preferably, and I hope we have a great remainder of the week, and good luck with Lesson 4.